Imagine you wake up one morning in medieval England and you decide to walk to Spain. Not drive, not fly. Walk. You've got a wooden staff, a leather satchel, some dried bread, and whatever's on your back. The road ahead is somewhere between 500 and 1,000 miles, depending on your route. You don't know exactly how long it will take. You don't know if you'll make it back. And here's the thing, you're not alone. Thousands of people are doing the exact same thing. Farmers, knights, merchants, priests, widows, thieves, all of them walking the same road toward the same distant, holy site. This wasn't a vacation. This was a pilgrimage. And if you think you know what that word means, I'm about to change your mind completely. Because the reality of medieval pilgrimage life was filthy, dangerous, deeply human, and more fascinating than anything Hollywood has ever bothered to show you. Stick with me. By the end of this, you'll never look at the Middle Ages the same way again. To understand a medieval pilgrimage, you first have to understand what life felt like in medieval Europe. Picture a world with no hospitals, at least none that could reliably help you. A world where the average person lived in a small village, rarely traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, and believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that suffering was part of a divine test, that God was watching, that sin accumulated, and that at the end of your life there was a reckoning. In that world, the idea of going on a pilgrimage, of making a physically dangerous, spiritually motivated journey to a holy site, wasn't just a religious tradition, it was a lifeline. It was one of the only ways ordinary people believed they could wipe the slate clean. The Catholic Church had made this crystal clear. Visit the tomb of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in Spain and earn a plenary indulgence, a formal reduction of your punishment in purgatory. Visit the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral in England, and your sins could be forgiven. Make it all the way to Jerusalem, the holiest city in the Christian world, and you were considered to have done something almost unimaginably sacred. But there was a catch. Actually, there were many catches. Getting there was the whole point. And getting there in medieval Europe was one of the most brutally difficult things a human being could do. The road was the test. The suffering was the prayer. And what happens next is where things get truly unbelievable.
So, who actually went on these pilgrimages? That's the first surprise. Because if you picture a medieval pilgrim, you might imagine a hunched, hollow-eyed monk shuffling through the rain. And sure, monks went, but so did everyone else. Merchants went, hoping God would bless their trades. Criminals went, because a judge might reduce their sentence if they completed a pilgrimage as penance. Sick people went, desperately hoping that the holy relics at the destination, a fragment of a saint's bone, a vial of miraculous oil, might cure what no physician could. Grieving mothers went. Newly freed serfs went. Ordinary farmers went, trading the monotony of their village for the terrifying open road. And here's something most people don't realize. Women went in enormous numbers. At a time when women were told to stay home, stay silent, and stay under the authority of a husband or father, pilgrimage was one of the only socially acceptable reasons for a woman to travel independently. Some historians believe that the pilgrimage road was, for many medieval women, the first and only adventure of their lives. Hey, real quick, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel, whether you're tuning in from New York, Texas, California, or somewhere in between. Let me know. Now, before you set out on your pilgrimage, there was a whole ritual you had to perform. First, you'd get your sins absolved by a priest. You'd settle your debts, write a will, say goodbye to your family, genuinely unsure if you'd see them again. Then you'd get your gear. The classic pilgrim kit was surprisingly minimal. A long wooden staff for balance and self-defense, a wide-brimmed hat to keep off the sun and rain, a scrip,
a small leather bag worn at the hip for carrying your most essential items, and a scallop shell, which was the symbol of the Santiago pilgrimage specifically. You'd sew it onto your cloak so that everyone you met on the road knew exactly what you were doing. That scallop shell mattered more than you'd think. It was essentially an ancient passport. It told innkeepers, townspeople, and crucially, bandits, that you were a pilgrim. And there was a widespread belief, even among thieves, that robbing a pilgrim brought terrible divine punishment. It didn't always stop them, but it helped more often than you'd expect. You'd also carry some food, dried bread, salted fish, maybe some hard cheese, though not much because the bag was heavy and the roads were long. You'd rely on the charity of monasteries, local churches, and hospices specifically built for pilgrims. These pilgrim hospitals, called hospitia, were scattered along the major routes, and they were literally free. Run by monks or local religious orders, they fed you, gave you a bed, and sometimes treated your wounds or illnesses. But the road itself, that's a completely different story, and where things start to get genuinely dark. The medieval road was not a highway. Let's get that clear immediately. In some parts of Europe, the Roman roads were still in use, ancient stone paths built 1,000 years earlier that were remarkably still the best infrastructure around. But between those stretches, mud. Endless, ankle-deep, boot-swallowing mud in the winter and spring, dust that coated your lungs and eyes in summer, rocky, unmarked trails through forests where you could genuinely get lost for days. And the forests were not safe. Banditry on the pilgrimage road was a constant, documented reality. Criminal gangs knew exactly when pilgrimage season was because it ran on a fairly predictable schedule tied to feast days and good weather. They knew the routes. They'd wait at choke points, narrow mountain passes, river crossings, isolated stretches of forest, and prey on pilgrims who strayed from the main group. This is part of why pilgrims almost always traveled in groups. There was genuine safety in numbers, and those groups could be surprisingly large, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, all moving at roughly the same pace. The pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, the Camino de Santiago, had so many travelers at its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries that entire support economies sprang up along the road. Inns, food stalls, souvenir sellers, yes, medieval souvenir sellers, and guides who would, for a fee, walk you through the trickiest sections. In fact, this part of the story, the sheer insanity of medieval travel, recently sent millions of people down a rabbit hole online. And today, we're going even deeper than the surface-level stuff you've probably seen before. Because here's the angle that almost no one talks about. The pilgrimage road had its own social world, its own culture, its own economy, and its own darkness. There were con artists who posed as pilgrims specifically to gain access to charity and hospitia without the dangerous journey. There were relic merchants who sold pilgrims fake relics at outrageous prices, a claimed tooth of St. Peter, a splinter of the true cross, and made fortunes exploiting desperate faith. The satirist Erasmus, writing in the early 1500s, noted with withering humor that if you collected all the fragments of the true cross being sold across Europe, you'd have enough wood to build a fleet of ships. Then there were the diseases. A large group of people walking hundreds of miles, sleeping in shared dormitories, eating questionable food, drinking from whatever water sources they could find, was basically a perfect petri dish. Dysentery was common. Foot infections from blisters that turned septic were terrifyingly frequent. The pilgrim hospital records from medieval Spain and France contain heartbreaking entries of pilgrims who walked 1,000 miles, survived bandits and mountain passes, and then died within sight of their destination from infections that modern antibiotics would cure in 3 days. Quick question for you, and I want a real answer in the comments. If you had to choose Team Faith or Team Survival, would you have gone on a pilgrimage knowing the risks? Drop it below. I read every single one. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share in the next part is something that almost never gets talked about. Let me tell you about a woman named Margery Kempe. Margery was born in Norfolk, England, around 1373. She was a merchant's wife, a mother of 14 children, and by her own account, which she dictated because she couldn't write, she was a deeply troubled soul. She experienced what modern psychologists might diagnose as postpartum psychosis after her first child. She had visions. She wept uncontrollably in churches. She made people deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And she went on pilgrimages. A lot of them. Margery traveled to Jerusalem. She traveled to Rome. She walked the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. She was, by medieval standards, absolutely extraordinary. A middle-class Englishwoman crossing the known world, navigating foreign languages and hostile strangers, surviving shipwrecks and illness, arguing with priests who wanted her to stop weeping so loudly during Mass. Her account, the book of Margery Kempe, is considered the first autobiography ever written in the English language. And it's not a spiritual text in the dry, formal sense. It's a human document. It's full of fear and petty conflict and exhaustion and moments of extraordinary beauty. In one passage, she describes sitting on a hillside overlooking Jerusalem for the first time and bursting into tears so violent that the pilgrims around her thought she was having a fit. She made it home. Not everyone did. The road to Jerusalem was the most dangerous of all. It required crossing the Mediterranean, which meant sailing on medieval ships with no weather forecasting, no GPS, no lifeboats worth the name. It meant passing through lands controlled by various Islamic powers, which, depending on the century and the political climate, could be welcoming to Christian pilgrims or actively hostile. It meant navigating a world where the rules changed at every border. And yet they went, wave after wave of them, century after century. Why? That's the question that haunts me about this whole story, because the rational answer, the safe answer, was always to stay home. The risks were real. The physical suffering was guaranteed. The spiritual reward was, by definition, a matter of faith. But pilgrimage offered something else, something that's easy to miss if you focus only on the religious dimension. It offered permission, permission to leave, permission to move. In a world where most people never went more than 20 miles from where they were born, the pilgrimage road was a doorway out of the ordinary world, a sanctioned escape, a chance to become, at least for a while, something bigger than a farmer's wife or a serf's son or a widow with nowhere to go. The road made you a pilgrim, and a pilgrim was special. A pilgrim was on a mission from God. That's a powerful thing to be, in any century. So what does all of this tell us? What this tells us is that pilgrimage was never just about faith. It was about the human need to move, to escape, to seek, to transform. The medieval pilgrim and the modern solo traveler booking a flight to somewhere they've never been are, at their core, doing the same thing. What this tells us is that ordinary people in the Middle Ages were not the passive, ignorant peasants that the history books sometimes make them out to be. They were making extraordinary choices under impossible conditions, navigating a world that was genuinely dangerous and doing it anyway, for reasons they believed in completely. What this tells us is that the road changes you. Every pilgrim account, from Margery Kempe to the anonymous accounts recorded in monastery guest books across Europe, describes arriving at the destination as a different person than the one who set out, not because a miracle happened, but because suffering and wonder and human connection have always been the most reliable engines of change. And finally, what this tells us is that history is full of stories we haven't heard yet. Stories of people who were brave and flawed and ridiculous and magnificent all at once. People who walked 1,000 miles in leather sandals because they believed it mattered. I think that matters too. If this story gave you something, even just one new way of seeing the world, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to hear stories like this. Now, I want to hear from you. Here's my question, and I want you to really think about it. If you could have gone on a medieval pilgrimage, which route would you have chosen? Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem? And why? Drop your answer in the comments below. I personally read every single one. And if you're new here, welcome. Hit that red subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss what we drop next. We cover the stories history books left out, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. This is Legends Historian, where forgotten stories find their voice. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and never stop asking why.